You don't ask to be part of G.I. Joe. You get asked.
So, I don't know if you all have noticed, but I'm something of a Stephen Sommers stan. I might not say lifelong, even though 3 of his movies define my whole childhood, with one being a gateway in particular to my love of horror. I've only recently come to appreciate his earnest and extremely affectionate approach to filmmaking. The Mummy is a bona fide classic that is beloved to this day for how fun and subtly good it is, even when it has big action set pieces like this.
Pembroke scholars never wrote about this.
Van Helsing is similarly earnest and full of love for what it's homaging, and the love for it is thankfully growing as the years go by. But there's another film in his canon, outside the Mummy sequels and everything he made before then, that I just can't get out of my head.
Get out! Nice shoes.
Before this year, you expected something very different when movies were made from toy lines, especially action figures. You expected something very ridiculous that would pick and choose among the vast canon and deliver a nice piece of entertainment, possibly even akin to how a child might play make-believe with the very toys the movie is based on. Or at least that's what I expect, and granted, I've been mostly very lucky with movies based on things I loved as a child. Movies based around toys were not always a safe bet, and there's a whole lot of history behind how these toys were sold to 80s children via cartoons such as Thundercats, He-Man, She-Ra, Transformers, and of course G.I. Joe. But check out Nerdstalgic's video how G.I. Joe brainwashed a generation to get words from the smart people.
G.I. Joe, fighting man from head to toe.
Although thought of as a distinctly 80s thing, the toy line started in 1964. And, in fact, you can thank it for popularising the term action figure, since they wanted to advertise to boys as Barbie's male counterpart. But the franchise, as most people remember it, began in 1982, when Hasbro enlisted Marvel to create an official canon, resulting in an animated series and comic book with the subtitle A Real American Hero, the latter of which became Marvel's best-selling comic at one point.
Its purpose, to defend human freedom against Cobra.
After that series ended, it was continued in several different incarnations, which is important to keep in memory before we get to 2009.
You know, like a super advanced robot. It's probably Japanese.
A certain movie based on another 80s toy line was a smash success, complete with 3 Oscar nominations, which was a far cry from when it was seen as a safer bet to release these adaptations as TV movies, and it shouldn't be understated just what a phenomenon Transformers was. It was before 80s nostalgia was considered an easy goldmine, and before the MCU was up and running, and it offered up a bombastic spectacle showcasing just how much special effects technology had advanced. We can criticize its writing and characterization all we want, but this was an event. So you bet Hasbro wanted to recreate that success with the IP that was just as beloved.
The time has come for the Cobra to rise up and reveal himself.
It's kind of surprising that Michael Bay directed Transformers and not G.I. Joe, considering it's a franchise practically made for him, but Revenge of the Fallen had to be rushed into pre-production to try and beat the 2007 writer's strike, so he was definitely tied up. Stephen Sommers had played with the toys as a child, and become enamored with the franchise after a trip to Hasbro's headquarters, thinking he could do his usual throwback style to the Bond films of the 60s, with the third act taking place underwater in a nod to Thunderball. He did not write this one as he did with The Mummy and Van Helsing, only getting a story by credit, and this was another film that was sped into production to try and beat the writer's strike, even after the script had been rewritten multiple times. Some might say this shows in the final product.
That redhead is really starting to piss me off.
Look, I'm not going to claim that this is a misunderstood masterpiece or the kind of perfection that The Mummy and Van Helsing are in delivering quality entertainment with a lot of substance to go with it, but G.I. Joe, The Rise of Cobra isn't that bad.
Hey, genius!
While it's not going to be as beloved as The Mummy, or get the kind of vindication that Van Helsing is starting to, it deserves to have a better public opinion.
He never gives up.
I am going to have to do my usual tangential comparison, but let's take 2 notable attempts at live-actioning similar properties from the last 2 decades for comparison: 2004's Thunderbirds and 2015's Gem and the Holograms. Thunderbirds was distinctly British and distinctly 60s, with an emphasis on espionage as well as adventure, and its live-action film was a dumbed-down, Americanized Spy Kids rip-off where its good points begin and end with Lady Penelope.
Hello, boys.
Jem and the Holograms was distinctly 80s and high camp, also notable for being one of the rare children's cartoons about adult women who had careers and weren't just princesses. The 2015 film stripped everything that fans loved about it to make it a bland teenage drama that had only one good scene. Both films are attacked for the two biggest sins an adaptation of a beloved kids franchise can commit: deviating from the source material and being cliched. Similar attacks are thrown at the Rise of Cobra, but I can't say I agree. First, this movie isn't a complete adaptation of the 80s cartoon, so a lot of what fans of that thought were changes to the canon just came from other cartoons, comics, and toy lines. The 80s cartoon was known for its low body count, where the Joes would shoot with laser guns and any exploding plane would show its pilot parachuting out just to confirm their survival. The Rise of Cobra showing on-screen deaths, however, is more in line with the direction the franchise had moved into in the 90s, starting with the G.I. Joe Extreme cartoon and the Devil's Due and Reloaded comics. The power suits the movie shows the Joes actually using comes from the Sigma 6 series, as does them working for the UN. The majority of lore comes from the comics, which had been ongoing for about 5 years at that point, and the crew poured through to try and get the script finished before the strike. It seems to be an attempted amalgamation of multiple sources, while still going for the tone of the first animated series. And there are plenty of Easter eggs and what have you in there that show actual effort was put in.
Where were you born? Duke wasn't born, he was government issued.
First of all, General Hawk says,
Knowing is half the battle.
to reference the famous PSAs that appeared at the end of the cartoon.
And knowing is half the battle.
Ripcord says this to Heavy Duty,
So real life like hell, but and a kung fu grip.
which was an advertising feature of the original toy line. Scarlet's costume during Paris evokes her original one in the cartoon, and General Hawk during the final battle likewise nods to his original action figures design. Snake Eyes likewise subtly changes costume multiple times throughout the film, which nods to the fact that he's the character with the most action figure variations in the franchise. When the Joes go to the Arctic, their gear clearly resembles the Snow Job character who didn't make it into the movie. And this scene?
But it's my last piece. Mm-hmm. Come on, give it to me. All right.
There was clearly effort put in, but look, I get it. Sleeping Beauty was my childhood obsession, and Prince Philip one of my idols, which is why I can't bear the thought of anyone thinking the Maleficent movie is anything other than a steaming pile of awfulness, because even us respect other people's opinions folks have our limits. But just like with Power Rangers 2017, after a while the complaints of it's not faithful enough begin to feel a bit much. So I guess I gotta go right ahead with my defense of this movie.
He's still alive!
He can't be, he's got 3 inch needles in his head.
Hey, that guy don't break dance.
I first became aware of how despised it was when Channing Tatum gave an interview on Howard Stern where he spoke candidly about his attitude towards it.
Look, I'll be honest. I fucking hate that movie.
You do? Why do you hate that movie?
I hate that movie. So I was pushed into doing that movie. From a movie that from Coach Carter.
But I think Chan the Man's comments are taken a little out of context, so let me give some. After Coach Carter got his career started, he signed a 3-picture deal with Paramount, and this was one of the movies he had to make for them. As in, they called in the middle of the writer's strike and basically said, "You're making this or we're suing you." As he was a fan of the cartoon, he asked if he could play Snake Eyes, but got forced into the role of Duke.
What about you?
He doesn't speak.
What? He doesn't say.
And Snake Eyes, who requires a specific type of athleticism and physicality, is really a better fit for him. I'm not a Step Up fan, but watch him move. He'd have been a great Snake Eyes. But of course, he's the attractive young stud they want to hype up as the leading man, and their first choice was deemed too old. He's not amazing the way B-Frey is in The Mummy, and it's not playing to his strengths, but he's fine.
Weapon specialist, jet qualified.
I told you. No, Rip.
I do have to laugh that Duke ends up captured in Paris, and the third act is partly a rescue mission because that is so this character. It's a bit of a joke in the fandom that although Duke is supposedly the leader of the Joes, he's usually the one who gets kidnapped or taken hostage, and I think that's also a good story move because it allows the supporting cast to shine while they work out how to save him and the day, because G.I. Joe was always an ensemble. A lot of these 80s merchandise-driven cartoons were. Even He-Man and Jem may have been fronted by one character, but pretty much every fan will give you a different answer if you ask which one was their favourite. And Rise of Cobra recognises that by giving everyone plenty of time. No one really gets an additional subplot because it ain't that kind of movie. But to quote Keith Chow from Nerds of Colour, The one thing the movie got right, unlike Transformers, is that each of the characters has a distinct personality. Even if they were all wearing the same black leather X-Men suits, each character on the team, Scarlet, Snake Eyes, Breaker, Heavy Duty, had a unique role and function. Marlon Wayans, of all people, is the second lead, and supposedly was auditioning for Heavy Duty, but they wanted him in a different role, with rumours about Stalker or Roadblock, who'd be played by Dwayne Johnson in the sequel, but they put him as Ripcord, who was more of a background character, for reasons I'm not quite sure of.
My bad. Don't have it again.
But since I don't plan to watch Requiem for a Dream or White Chicks again, and not for the same reasons, I'm just gonna call this my favourite Marlon Wayans.
What happened to you? I jumped over it. You could do that?
He's great. I love this Ripcord.
Told you to read that manual. It's a manual?
Do I even find myself kinda sorta digging the token romance between him and Scarlet? It's cute.
You're still here, right? You get knocked down, you get back up.
Scarlet herself is also very well done, and Rachel Nichols is fun in the part.
Some targets are harder to hit than others.
In a weird way, I find it unique that she isn't made the female lead, and they just let her be a fun supporting character with plenty of panache. Breaker is great too.
Finding a needle in a coal mine.
Haystack.
Oh, right. Haystack in a coal mine.
Heavy Duty is well utilised in a subtle way, but still makes an impression.
Don't make me shoot a woman.
Dennis Quaid is also unexpectedly perfect as General Hawk, and he supposedly did the role because his son was a G.I. Joe fan. And doing the math with his twins' ages means that the son in question, he got Huey'd into doing the film. B-Frey eats up the screen in his cameo as Sergeant Stone. Covergirl, okay, this one I got no defense of. Not so much getting killed off, although I don't think the movie needed another death at this point, but so much wasted potential given how interesting the character is. The prequel novel tries to explain that she got injured on a mission and couldn't fight anymore, but come on. Snake Eyes is great though, and although I'm sure Chan the Man would have done well in the part, Ray Park has the right physicality to both do the complex choreography, but also to act with his body rather than his face.
Hello, brother.
The character's backstory is very simplified and the flashbacks are a bit jarring, but the film does him justice. Snake Eyes is not someone who needs his own movie. He's there to be cool and steal a few scenes to help enhance the ensemble, and he most definitely accomplishes that. Helped by the movie getting his nemesis right too.
If I was spying on you, you would never know.
This is the best Storm Shadow. Lee Byung-hun knew what the assignment was and he had fun in the role. Storm Shadow is by far one of the best things about the film, which I still maintain is good actually.
Now you will die without a word.
There's just the right amount of build-up to make their big sword fight feel meaningful, and for this payoff to feel sufficiently earned. Arnold Vosloo is also suitably fun as Zartan. Even if it is weird to see him with clothes on, he just comes across as a nudist at heart. Christopher Eccleston is another one who hated the film, having only taken this and Thor: The Dark World after getting blacklisted by the BBC, but he's a great Destro, and I can't find it in myself to disapprove of this line.
I've finally taken my place in the long line of McCullens.
Joseph Gordon-Levitt, by contrast, was having great fun, which shows, and he put an absurd amount of work into making his voice resemble Chris Latter's work as Cobra Commander in the cartoon.
You will call me Commander.
If you're wondering why his final costume doesn't have a hood, there were apparently concerns that it would look too much like one of these guys. Too bad the fourth Harry Potter film didn't have that kind of restraint. His canon backstory is traditionally kept vague, beyond being a used car salesman, but the movie expands on this to incorporate one of the comic storylines in which he lost a brother in the Vietnam War and wanted revenge, except now he's the brother and wasn't lost completely. Now he's the brother of...
Beautiful Baroness.
Okay, so whenever this film is mentioned, I don't think I found an aspect that's as polarizing as the Baroness.
Do it. You already killed me once.
She's the most iconic villainess in the franchise and even has a trope named after her, referring to an Eastern European femme fatale who's more ruthless than seductive. The film first makes her an American, which seems to be a side effect of having a multinational cast, as Heavy Duty is now British and Breaker is French-Moroccan, and possibly also to distance the character from the influences that informed an ambiguously European villain created during the Cold War. It was the 2000s, when American creators were starting to feel a little guilty about how often they played the foreign villain trope, and I imagine the setting update to that time would also mean there's less obvious reason for an Eastern European terrorist. But I don't imagine anyone cares about that as much as they do about the choice to make her Duke's brainwashed ex who fights off the nanomachines and has a face turn.
Deep down, you're still the same man I fell in love with.
Don't force this.
It should be noted that the Baroness was brainwashed in at least one continuity, but continued to work with Destro once it wore off. This is also very rooted in 2000s attitudes that tended to put women on pedestals out of more guilt for the attitude towards them in the 80s following the collapse of second-wave feminism. Basically, people were worried it was sexist to have a female villain, and that women were inherently more moral or innocent than men. Just take note of how many films at the time showed the one female villain being the one to defect and join the heroes, which TV Tropes calls the high heel face turn. Since Rise of Cobra obviously was planned as a franchise starter, it could have opened a lot of possibilities for future films.
But when Rex programmed them, he sure didn't want them taken out.
So I imagine they had ideas in mind featuring the Baroness being a wild card who could succumb to brainwashing at any moment and couldn't be trusted. They didn't come to pass because Sienna Miller didn't return for the sequel, along with many other actors. She maintains that it's because she was terrible in the role, thinking she wasn't tall or intimidating enough to play a villain, as well as being embarrassed about how she couldn't fire a gun without blinking, requiring them to change her glasses to sunglasses to hide it.
Next time, I'll drive.
Whatever her thoughts, I happily point to her performance as a highlight of the movie. She is a great Baroness, and very fun to watch, and seems like she's enjoying herself in the kind of shameless villain role that most actresses are eager to play because they so rarely come along.
Now you have to admit, you had that coming.
And I see complaints that making the Baroness a brainwashed good girl turns her into a damsel, and I'll use that to provide the lone bit of actual substance in this video. First, a damsel is just a young, unmarried woman, and with the Baroness having married into her title in this continuity, did we learn something today?
I suppose I should be grateful.
Most husbands would be.
The word you're looking for is captive, and even then, she fights off the brainwashing herself and saves Duke, who is the actual captive in this situation. And as I've said elsewhere, an imperiled female character is only a true damsel in distress if she is a complete innocent who has nothing to do with the conflict. Which, actually, she does kind of count. But even then, she's not the plot motivator, and saves herself in the end, fighting alongside Duke as an equal.
Let's get him.
That's my girl.
I get why some people just want her to be ruthlessly evil, and she is very fun when that's what she's doing, but I still love this Baroness too. I just wish the movie had leaned more into the interesting, leading a double life element it introduced, with her husband having no idea about her true identity.
Most husbands don't have such mysterious wives.
It would have been nice to get a round two between her and Scarlett as well. And as I often seem to when I talk about the films of Stephen Sommers, I will praise the action. With this being a film set in the modern day rather than his more famous period pieces, there is more emphasis on shootouts, but the futuristic technology allows for plenty of madness too. The one weak action scene is Duke's convoy being ambushed at the start, which is a bit too chaotic and confusing, but things improve once the Joes start showing up. Snake Eyes, Scarlett, and Heavy Duty are all introduced very well and given creative ways to shine. My favourite sequence is actually Cobra storming the pit, even if I do choose to believe that CoverGirl just decided to take a nap at a very bad time. First off, a high sequence is usually what you'd see on the protagonist's side, so showing it from the perspective of the villains, with us now rooting for the heroes to stop them, is pretty neat. The Storm Shadow Snake Eyes connection is conveyed in quick succession, and gives us a delightfully extra sword fight between them that has honestly entered the Dragon levels of quality. The Baroness fighting a camouflaged Scarlett is a touch of brilliance, and I love the pragmatism in this fight, which again would normally put the character using concealment on the villain's side, but Scarlett is the Joe's intelligence expert.
I'm tracking the kill switch now.
The road rage sequence in Paris is ridiculous, and I love it. And by ridiculous, I mean fantastic. I don't know why I'm only now starting to become appreciative of fun car chase scenes, but since the movie is not remotely concerned with grounded realism, it gives us what we in the academic field call a doozy.
I don't have them! Where are they?
Joking aside, it utilizes all members of the team and is paced very well, going from a car chase also involving bikes and trains to a foot chase through a multi-story building, and finally, a getaway in a helicopter. Throughout the scene, the main tension switches from stopping the bad guys from doing something bad to preventing the bad thing from getting worse.
Duke, it's on the Baroness. Storm Shadow has one of the warheads, and it's armed.
A race against time is a good way to keep me invested these days, probably coming from my own anxieties about being late for things, and it utilizes the same mini 3-act structure of an action sequence Stephen Sommers previously used for the brides attacking the village in Van Helsing. The action doesn't run over long and utilizes the concept to its full potential. And since the movie has made it clear we're not supposed to take it seriously, we can allow ourselves to believe that all those flying cars were just conveniently empty. The third act sequence at the underwater base then flips things around from the one in the pit, with it now being the Joes who are storming the enemy base, but as honestly as one can.
To rewire the laser panel's brain back carefully.
Again, all team members are very well utilised, and they again let Scarlett do her thing as the intelligence expert as well as an action girl, being the one to direct Ripcord to...
What? Tagine. It's Celt, Scottish, for fire.
Okay, I knew I loved this movie the second Moscow was saved by voice-activated controls that only responded to Scots Gaelic. And like Van Helsing, the climax juggles 3 separate action sequences in Duke and the Baroness in the sub, Ripcord trying to get the last missile, and the grudge match between Storm Shadow and Snake Eyes. Obviously, I prefer the Van Helsing climax, what with it featuring werewolves and Elena Anaya, but this is still pretty fun, and I kinda think I actually prefer Storm Shadow vs Snake Eyes to Dracula vs Van Helsing. Remember in the 2000s when we just loved katanas and putting them into everything? The climax has several payoffs going off at once, and each one of them builds on the previous one so that the one before the end doesn't set the bar too high and make the rest feel like they're dragging things out. We even get a fun sequence involving the Joes having to evacuate before the base is destroyed by the falling ice chunks that they said are laced with steel. That's why they're not floating, that's what I'm telling myself.
There's a ton of steel and ice headed your way.
What?
Only Stephen Sommers could assemble a bunch of action beats that an enthusiastic 8-year-old would come up with on the spot and make it work as the conclusion to a summer action movie. And of course, what does Heavy Duty say to end the situation?
Yo, Joe!
G.I. Joe: The Rise of Cobra became the third Hasbro film to open at #1 at the box office, after the 2 Transformers entries, in a far cry from the days when they dumped these things on TV out of fear of financial losses, and signalling that many more big-budget Hasbro properties would hit the big screen, including, bizarrely enough, Battleship, starring Rihanna, that got a $220 million budget. That's what they gave the board game with no lore, but they only gave Gem and the Holograms $5 million.
Create your own destiny, right?
But while it did spell dollar signs for Hasbro, and paved the way for legitimately good adaptations like Power Rangers 2017, Bumblebee, and Honor Among Thieves, it seemed to signal a swan song for Stephen Sommers. Although critics were kinder to the film than audiences, he took the majority of the blame from fans the same way John M. Chu did for Gem and the Holograms, getting a Razzie nomination for Worst Director and eventually dropping out of the sequel. He only directed one more film that sought limited release because of legal issues, and all his IMDb shows since then are executive producer credits on the Scorpion King video games. I mean, slowing down after 3 decades in the industry is perfectly logical, especially when it wasn't exactly small indie films you were making, but the narrative was eventually set that Rise of Cobra was the career killer.
Well, everybody's sorry about something.
And I wouldn't care if it was something on the quality level of Showgirls or Valley of the Dolls, and even the directors of those still made plenty of films afterwards. And since I've now gone and properly dissected 2 of his highest profile films, I'm starting to notice a common thread that connects an adventure comedy about an all-powerful mummy, an action horror involving monster crossovers, and a movie based on a series of action figures, and that's earnestness.
Boy, don't stop being all nice to me now.
They were directed by a person who very clearly loves all types of movies, and with the energy that says, here are my influences, hope you enjoy them too. The Mummy and Van Helsing were that for Universal Horror and Adventure, and while Rise of Cobra was an assignment rather than a passion project, he brought that same earnestness anyway. It was tropey, sure, but for me, that worked. Big time. The movie was shameless fun, and not in a cynical, insult your intelligence sort of way. At least for me anyway. I don't have the same level of affection for it as The Mummy and Van Helsing, probably because I was a little older when I saw it, but I have enough to spend an astonishing amount of time and energy creating a video essay giving it some level of defense.
There's a door! Night one. Right!
I know if I had seen it as a young child, it probably would have been my favourite movie of all time for a while, and you'd be getting an even longer passionate defense on why it's good actually. I mean, it's not perfect, but more than worthy of getting some flowers, and it was my gateway to the franchise. So I guess by now I've lost any and all credibility, and there can only be one appropriate way to end this discussion. Yo, Joe!